Good morning, everyone. It is park time. Well, good morning, Lionhearts. It's your old pal Jordan the Lion. How are you all doing today? I hope you said well. Well, yep, you saw how we started. We're here at the dog park. Jaw's gonna get his time in, and then you and I will head off. We're gonna go to a cemetery today, and we're going to go visit a legend. We're gonna go visit a woman who is synonymous now, kind of, with bondage and sex and pinup. Her look is very distinct, and right in the middle of all of it, she walked away. Daze with Jordan the Lion begins now, and today we're going to talk about Miss Bettie Page. There he comes. So even though we're going to be heading off to Westwood Cemetery, or Pierce Brothers as it's officially known, if I don't put some Jaw in this video, people get upset. So there you go, you had to see a little bit of Jaw, didn't you? Alright, we've made it to Westwood, passing the Federal Building right here. I tell you, when I move, I am not going to miss this traffic, not one bit. I've probably been sitting on this stretch from light to light for at least 5 or 6 minutes. Here's our hidden entrance. Here we are, Pierce Brothers, Westwood Village. A very small but a very popular and heavily visited cemetery. Lots of famous people buried here. Alright, I've found Bettie before. I believe she's over here somewhere. We will find her. She's beside someone famous as well, but not someone that had any affiliation with her. Just kind of an odd person to be buried next to. Boy, does she have a story. So here she is, right here next to Alan Melvin, who was Sam the Butcher on the Brady Bunch. Very famous character actor. Right here is Miss Bettie Page, queen of the pinups. What a story. Now, Bettie, originally when she was born, wanted to be an actress. And unfortunately, her family was very poor. Her mother and father didn't have much, weren't very educated. They had 6 children, but her father had a hard time keeping a job and eventually ended up getting thrown in jail for stealing cars, and he and his wife got a divorce. He never took care of the family after that, and Bettie's mother, being someone who, you know, didn't have much of an education, she could only do so much in taking care of 6 children, Bettie being the oldest. Bettie ended up stepping in and taking care, basically being a mother to her younger brothers and sisters. And since they didn't have a lot of money, Bettie would learn how to sew and make their clothes. She would also learn how to cut hair. And eventually her mother just didn't have the money to take care of the kids, and ended up putting some of them in an orphanage and put Bettie and her sister in a girls' school for a few years. Now there, Bettie would try and cheer her sister up by just saying, hey, let's just make believe we're in a movie. And that's kind of how they would try and get through it. And then eventually her mother would get all the kids back, would save up some money and get the kids back. And Bettie just decided then that she didn't ever want to be beholden to a man. She didn't ever want to rely on a man. So she became an excellent student. She excelled at drama and was on the debate team and tried to become valedictorian. She ended up salutatorian, which was basically the 2nd highest grade average in her class. And if she would have gotten valedictorian, she would have gotten a full scholarship to a college, but instead, being salutatorian, she received a bit of a scholarship for a women's teaching school. So that's what Bettie did. Now, because Bettie's mother married the first man that she fell in love with, she didn't want her daughter to do the same. So while Bettie was in school, she was not supposed to date or have a boyfriend. And of course, she fell in love with the rival school's star quarterback. And they secretly were dating. And then when they graduated, they ended up getting married. she went on to school and then became a teacher where she had went to school. But apparently some of the students had a hard time taking her seriously because she was so beautiful. Even in those days, Bettie had developed her own workout routine, so she didn't have your normal body. She had a very fit body, and I guess it was very distracting. So her husband decided to join the military, and he went off for training in San Francisco, and Bettie went along with him and decided to become a secretary there while she tried to figure out a way to possibly become an actress. So one day while Bettie was working as a secretary, a man came in and said that he thought that she should try for a screen test, and he helped arrange it. He made advances at her, and she turned him down because she was, of course, married. Her husband at this point had been sent off to, been sent overseas, and so she came down to do the screen test, and since she turned that man down, he instructed the people doing the screen test to basically accent all of her worst features and made her up to look like Joan Crawford with those high eyebrows and a wide mouth and all this, and it just was not flattering at all. And then they told her, you know, you have to dye your hair blonde and you have to change your look. So she ended up going back to San Francisco, and when her husband came home and found out that she'd been pursuing acting, he got mad and said, that's it, we're going back to Nashville, which is where Bettie was born and where she was from. And Bettie really wanted to pursue having a artistic career, so she decided to get a divorce, and she moved to New York City and worked as a secretary again for a couple of years while trying to audition for plays. Unsuccessfully, she would submit to modeling agencies, and even the Ford modeling agency turned her down, saying that she was too short and that her hips were too wide. And then eventually one day she was walking down Coney Island, and a man doing push-ups there noticed her and started talking to her, and he said he was a photographer and would like to photograph her. And they made a deal basically that she would do a session for free, and in return she would get a portfolio of pinup shots. And he ended up, while he was taking the photos, telling her, well, you have kind of a high forehead, you should consider giving yourself bangs. So she went home, cut her own bangs, and that became her look for the rest of her life, believe it or not. So Bettie did the photo shoot, and she joined this camera club that he was a part of, where men or photographers would pay to come take photos in a session with various models that they would hire. And apparently Bettie was getting more of the attention than most of the models, because Bettie always looked like she was having a great time. She was always bubbly, smiling, and as she would say, whenever I took photos, I always treated the camera like it was my boyfriend and that I was making love to it through the lens. So surprisingly, at the age of 27, the time most women are retiring their modeling career, Bettie is just starting in 1950. So she started taking photos through here and would make her own costumes, actually invented those bikinis that she would wear, which is really interesting because at the time everyone was wearing one-piece bathing suits, and Bettie was creating bikinis and using wild leopard prints and various different things. In fact, one couple hired her and said, bring every style of bathing suit that you have, hired her for a shoot, photographed her and everything, and then created bathing suits based off of those on their own, marketed them, and sold them as Bettie Page bathing suits. And she got nothing for it and never sued them or anything. But for years, she was making a lot of money doing all these photos. And she said eventually it turned into nude photos, which she said she didn't have a problem with because she felt as long as it was artistic and they were tastefully done, there was nothing wrong with it. She said Adam and Eve were born nude, and you know, so there's nothing wrong with that as long as you're not being promiscuous about it. She felt that it was okay. So over time, they would push the envelope and her photos would get more and more risque, to where the FBI would start investigating whether or not she was doing pornography, whether these actually classified as pornography. So at one point, Bettie paired up with a couple who decided to film Bettie, because Bettie was still hoping at some point to get into legitimate movies. So she hooked up with this couple that would film her doing, you know, kind of bondage films and things like that. And then she would get even further investigated by the FBI. She would be cleared, and so would the couple, of any kind of pornography, but it kind of ruined her reputation. So when she would be out and about, people would kind of give her dirty looks and say things. And eventually she started getting death threats that the FBI had to come in and use Bettie as bait, because they thought that this was a notorious serial killer threatening her. And when they ended up catching this person, it was a 16-year-old kid. So Bettie Page had never met Hugh Hefner. However, she became one of the Playboy pinups, and also was notorious for that for the rest of her career. Now, she ended up retiring at the age of 34 because she said she just felt like the market was oversaturated with her, and she also felt like she'd kind of done everything and that she was getting too old. And plus, it was starting to take a toll on her mental state with that death threat and everything. And what a lot of people didn't know is that when she had first moved to New York, she had been gang assaulted, and when she was young, she'd been molested by her father, so she had a lot of trauma that she had been holding in. And she ended up retiring, moved to Florida. She had some money. She had about $1 million at that time. Moved to Florida and became born again. Became a born-again Christian and started studying, hoping to become a missionary. But when they found out that she had been divorced, they said that she was unfit to be a missionary. And Bettie ended up getting married a total of 4 times. She was married a couple of times after she retired, and she said, you know, she couldn't even get a date when she was doing these photos because everyone was too afraid to ask her out or anything. And she said that kind of followed her after this. So she said once she, you know, realized she couldn't become a missionary, she went back to being a secretary for Billy Graham, of all people. And then at some point she started having a mental breakdown and attacked her landlord, was put in a asylum for 10 years, and came out and really had nothing, had no money. She didn't want to be known. She hadn't taken a photo since the beginning of 1958. I think like January 58 was the very last photo of anyone had seen of her. And she was kind of embarrassed at that point. She had been taught by the church, apparently, that she should be embarrassed of her former life, so she was. And eventually, in the 80s, the man who was writing The Rocketeer based one of his characters off of her found out that she was living in kind of a group home outside of Los Angeles, ended up meeting with her, and then introduced her to Hugh Hefner. And when Hugh Hefner met her, found out that she had no money and was really, really poor. He said that he told her about how a company had taken over Marilyn Monroe and James Dean's likeness, and that they could help her make money. So that's exactly what ended up happening. Bettie Page became heavily saturating the market, even more than she ever had, because she was so well known for her bangs and her fitness and her fashion and her style and everything. Over the years, that had become mainstream, and Bettie ended up dying in 2008. She went into the hospital, and the family had to eventually take her off life support. She died of a heart attack, but at the time of her death, she was worth $20 million and has went down as the queen of the pinups, the most famous pinup of all time. Now, what's interesting is that the man who paid for Bettie to be buried here is also buried here, Hugh Hefner. So Bettie is laid to rest right here. And she did so many photos, they said combined, she did more photo shoots than Marilyn Monroe and Cindy Crawford. Hugh Hefner is buried over here in this wall crypt, right near Marilyn Monroe, who was also one of the biggest times for Playboy. She was really what made the Playboy magazines start selling. So we'll go visit them while we're here. And apparently in those days, models didn't really work out or anything. They just relied on their natural beauty. And so Bettie set a new benchmark for modeling, where you had to look good, you had to be fit, and most of them would make their own clothes. So here's Marilyn. And then here is Hugh Hefner. Now, it was said that Hugh Hefner would sleep with every person who was a centerfold for Playboy, 11 out of the 12 that would be featured. So Bettie was one that he actually never met until the 90s. He purchased her photo from a photographer and featured her in 1955, but he never met her until then. And then when he did, he actually changed her life. Now, when I moved to Hollywood, a friend of mine, the very first year that I went to music school, he was obsessed with Bettie Page and everything Bettie Page. He had every shirt that you could buy on Hollywood Boulevard he owned that was Bettie Page. And that's how I found out about her. And he had an interview disc because throughout her life she refused to ever be photographed. Even when she did an interview later on in life, the stipulation was that it was an audio only interview and that they wouldn't show her face, because she said, nobody wants to have that image ruined. I want people to remember me the way I was. But she said in that, I remember that she lived about an hour outside of Los Angeles, and that one day a year she would take a bus into Hollywood and she would walk up and down Hollywood Boulevard to remember the old times, and then she would get back on the bus and go home. Rest in peace, Bettie Mae Page. And when she was born, her name was actually spelled with a Y. It was B-E-T-T-Y. But as a little girl, she always liked this spelling, and that's the one that she went with. All right, my friends, we're gonna call it a day. Thank you, Randy and Michelle Garacki and Kirsten Lyle, for becoming my newest Patreons. Thank you all for watching, and go look at some beautiful Bettie Page photos. What a lovely woman she was, and it's true, when you look at her photos, she always looked so happy. Have a great night, everyone. We'll see you all next time. Have a great night, and goodbye.